cleaner too if initially you want to start modeling your real world with similarly named entities. Courses, to give you a generic interface to all the courses, but then a course API, which gives you a very concrete interface to just one, and each of them can have its own queries inside of it. Lastly, the observer pattern, and there's dozens more. And for Project 1, what we'll do is recommend some reading on some of these patterns in the context of PHP. I think you'll often find that if you're using a framework like CodeIgniter or something else, you're either going to be forced to adhere to one or more design patterns, whether or not you like it, as in the case of CodeIgniter. But any other framework, too, will just make you adhere to their own patterns, most likely. Or if you actually start rolling things your own and implementing things from scratch, you'll find that these are often very common paradigms to adhere to rather than reinventing the wheel. And I'll admit, frankly, and as you read up on these things, especially if you've been programming for a couple of years now, even I had this realization. I forget which, it wasn't one of these on the list, but recently I was reading up on some new fancy design pattern. I was like, oh my God, I invented that 2 years ago. Because now someone had come up with a name for just something, frankly, that flowed naturally from some prior problem I had solved. And I don't even remember what it was, but I remember being angry that this guy now got to name this design pattern. Observer, though, refers to what's called a publish subscribe method, but I'll wave my hand at that for now because we'll see that a whole lot in iOS. Any questions? No? All right, so let's go ahead and take our 5-minute break here, and we'll resume with some actual code. So we are back. So just to recap, recall that the singleton design pattern generally refers to having some class of interest to you, but only having one object of it. We've seen this in CodeIgniter in the context of databases, and we'll see it again, but this time with our own homegrown code so that we can sort of ignore the distractions and the peculiarities of that particular framework and focus really on the core idea. And we'll also look at this data access object model, which tends to work very nicely in conjunction with the sorts of code that I was just sketching as pseudocode in Notepad there just a moment ago. So in terms of applying this to Project 0 and Project 1, the mental model should be as follows. Shoehorning some of these examples into CodeIgniter won't quite work because, again, when using a framework, you typically have to adapt to it and not so much the other way around. If you find yourself doing it the other way around, that's the point at which you start making your own framework or shopping around for something else. So just realize the goal is not to inject the same code into your CodeIgniter solutions, but to recognize it as representative of the same ideas we're going to see in Objective-C starting in a week, and also as an alternative to using something like CI so that for, say, Project 1, you can actually consider doing a little more of it on your own from scratch, especially if that helps you wrap your mind around some of the particular aspects of these things. So let's do this. Let me go into courses.xml just for a quick teaser of what has been in here, but I'm guessing you're all too familiar with this by now. So what's nice about the XML file, let me increase the font size. What's nice about the XML file is that imperfect though it is structurally, it at least does embody within a single course element most everything you need for that particular course. But there's a number of issues, right? We don't have a separate XML file for all the departments at Harvard. We don't have a separate XML file for all of the things called course groups, which are different, right? Department is something like Division of Engineering and Applied Sciences, but course group is computer science. And arguably, it's usually the latter that actual students care about. And then you don't have a faculty XML file. Rather, you have the same faculty intermingled again and again and again in all of the various courses that they teach. So when importing this XML file, and let's not spend too much time on the import here because odds are you're at this point or beyond, but let me propose a few tweaks that you might make to your own import script, or even if you're content with how you've imported the data, something to keep in mind for Project 1 or beyond when you have to go through a similar exercise, designing a database schema and getting a whole lot of data into it, not just once, but rather in a way that you can do it again and again. For instance, if your import script right now is not designed in such a way that you could rerun it if we hand you a new courses.xml file tomorrow without having to manually delete all of your tables and start fresh with PHP and Mindman, like there's an opportunity there for improvement. It's not an explicit requirement, and this is one of the curveballs we might have thrown you, but these are the kinds of things you want to keep in mind, designing with reusability in mind. So let me propose this, and this code is online, so you're welcome to adapt some of its own features or not at all if you would like, or if you're still at that point with the first Project 0. But let me point out a few salient design decisions I made when importing just part of the XML file. This does not load everything that you need, but it does load enough so that we can have an interesting conversation in the context of design patterns now. So among the design decisions I made for this import script is one. And for those unfamiliar who forgot, in 50, when you wrote a command line script, or we implemented Speller with a command line script, recall that just because PHP is 99% of the time used in web context doesn't mean it has to be, right? You can use it for what are called command line scripts. And the easiest way to do this is to start the top of your file with the so-called shebang, which is just the path to the interpreter that you want to use to actually execute this file. And it doesn't have to be PHP. It can be Bash, which is a shell. It can be Python. It can be Ruby. This is an incredibly common paradigm. And in fact, the file name doesn't even have to end in .php for this to work. You can call it anything you want. And arguably for a command line script, you shouldn't call it .php because the convention is typically for executable programs, even if they're interpreted scripts, to not have some file extension. For those unfamiliar, what does env do? Because this is not the path to PHP.
It finds the PHP binary in the path.
Exactly. It finds PHP for you. So this is actually a nice portable way of writing a script that is more likely, not guaranteed, to work on other people's computers as well. But conversely, PHP is usually in /user/bin/php or /user/local/bin/php. If you hard code any of those and then give your code to someone else, they might have to manually change the file. So env just lowers the probability of issues like that. Constants, so this is one way you could do it. This is just good convention. If you've been using variables, maybe they're even capitalized variables, that's fine, especially for a small script. You're not likely to change the values, and you're only using them once. But in general, using constants is a good thing. And a better thing, frankly, would be to put it in some other file, or maybe even take it as a command line argument, just so that the script's a little less hard-coded. What's this doing? Well, you can use argv in PHP to take command line arguments. Right? So this was one design decision I made with my command line script. I want to be able to rerun this on different files. Maybe I'm going to start using saving copies of XML files from every day that I get the feed from the registrar. So I want to just be able to run this not with a hard-coded file name, but I want it to take as an argument at argv1 the name of a file, which I just convey the idea of with this statement here. Die, for those unfamiliar, means exit with this particular error message. This is the use of some exceptions. We'll see a little more of this in Objective-C, but you can read it pretty top to bottom. Try this, and if it fails, catch the error and do this with it. Well, just die and call the getMessage method inside of the exception object that was thrown, that I've caught, which somehow embodies whatever it is that went wrong. It's probably a typo, it's wrong username, wrong password, something to that effect. Now notice, this is not super friendly to just die with an arcane error message, but realize the user base here. This script is for me and my fellow developers to use. It's not for users. We don't have to dumb things down or simplify things. In fact, I want more technical information. So that's reasonable. Now let's fast forward to the actual loading part. So I regret not having mentioned that what that IBM article does is idiotic, by putting an XML file inside of a PHP file. I have no idea why they did that, because you can take an XML file and just load it directly from disk. So my apologies if you went that way at their advice. I see some smiles, or horrified smiles. That is just the wrong solution, and I don't know why they did that. They should have just said, take this XML file, or given an XML file. So here it turns out, simple XML load file will load an XML file into a big string, and then parse it and hand you back the so-called DOM, which if you think back to 50 is the tree-like structure that represents a web page, or in this case, an XML document. I'm just checking the error messages, and for those who don't recall or are unfamiliar, what's equals equals equals? Yeah, so this is checking for equality of value and also type. So this is actually in PHP a good habit to get into because PHP is so loose when it comes to data typing. This way, you're not going to confuse a value of 0, which is not like, it won't actually happen here. But in the interest of like really rigorous code, saying that I not only want it to equal the equivalent of false, it has to be literally false. And because the documentation says literally false will be returned. Now, we'll come back to this in a moment, but if you're not using transactions, this is something that would have been good to use in your import script, or if still working on it, would be, for reasons we'll see in a moment. So first, my script deletes everything from the database. Now, here is the motivation for transactions. If you are updating your XML database and you have actual users shopping for courses on your site, what happens if you have some bug or mistake in your code or your server is just slow? You probably don't want to dump your whole database while users are shopping, because all of a sudden they're going to see nothing, potentially. It might be a small window of time, but it could happen. The transaction is going to ensure that all of this is going to happen for me atomically. And so in theory, the users should not notice, because their queries will get serialized before my transaction and after, not in the middle. So now I do this. And this, you probably have code like this. So let me wave my hands at some of the DOM parsing code, but just to give you a sense of what I did. I'm iterating over each course. I am then just doing a filter here. And you don't, we said you have to minimally support spring 2012. So that's what I'm minimally doing here by filtering out the others. I'm extracting some values. As an aside, I'm explicitly casting a lot of my values to strings, because even though you don't quite need to know this when using simple XML, they do some fancy PHP trickery so that anytime you ask for a value back using the simple XML API, you actually get back an object. And there's a lot of implicit conversion to a string, which is